Hello and welcome to Empire Watch Global Sound Rising. Very smooth. I was so excited about this show, and I'm so nervous and excited about what's coming up. So I really hope you guys enjoy it. Thank you so much for the commenters, returning commenters, Raphael, Italal. We do recognize your names, and welcome, Lizzie F8826. This is our.
We know Lizzie. We met her at David's.
Oh, really? Amazing.
Yes,
Okay. Well,
yes.
thank you so much for the support. We really appreciate it. I'm Ileana Chan. Welcome to Global South Rising, where we break down the weekly news from around the world through an anti-imperialist lens every week on Friday, 9 a.m. BRT, 12 p.m. UTC, 8 p.m. Beijing time. We dismantle imperial narratives with an analysis, opinion, and in-depth discussions on the challenges, achievements, and contradictions of building a new multilateral world. I'm here with my co-host, Sara Vivacqua. Hello, Sara. And also our very special guest, friend of the show, hopefully a recurring guest. So please, everyone, do not scare him away. Though he's been through the trenches, I do believe he will come back. Carlos Martinez. To give our quick bio for Carlos. Carlos Martinez is a researcher, author, and political activist from the UK. His latest book is The East is Still Red, China's Socialism in the 21st Century. He is a co-founder and co-editor of Friends of Socialist China and the co-founder of No Cold War. And I also have his book here.
Okay,
so everybody has to brilliant. Perfect. Okay, so everyone knows what that book looks like. I think I should actually put the link in the description. I'm sorry.
It's a great book. If you don't know anything about China like me, you need to be educated on China. It's very factual, very easy to understand, but in depth, very in depth. So it's a great book. I can only recommend Carlos where people can get the book. Please don't say Amazon.
Probably the easiest way is to go on, just search for it on the Friends of Socialist China website, which is socialistchina.org.
That link is actually in the description. Yay! Okay,
Hey!
The link is in the description, but I'll put it in the chat again. But we're really excited. We have a lot of very difficult questions for Carlos, of course. We have to put him through the paces. But the topics with Carlos will be the Iran geopolitical implications, why China will not militarily intervene, and then we're also going to talk about the China 2 sessions and Booker Omole, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Communist Party Marxists of Kenya, was captured, tortured. He's out on bail, but we'll be catching up on that story. And also we'll be talking more about digital sovereignty with you and with João as well. So just to give the audience a little bit of what to expect, we're doing the first hour with Carlos, and then we will go into our, what we're terming segments called watches. We'll see how that sticks. But essentially, Sara, João Amorim, who will be our co-host in the second hour, we will be doing our reports on the world news and the Global South Rising. So yeah, but first, shall we crack into the questions?
Yeah, I can redo my introduction.
Yes,
I think it's only fitting this show, the Global South Rising. If it used to be a fragmented evidence of the Global South, I think we are experiencing a shift. So I have prepared my introduction, and I wanted to read them out, if you don't mind. I think it's fitting, Ileana, just to inaugurate this new era. We've seen on the 28th of February, the US and Israel, in violation of international law and any basic human decency, launched unprovoked strikes on Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, Kermanshah, sorry, I can't really pronounce them, and targeting a school, killing around 106 girls in Minab. I wonder if this is the women liberation they are proposing to from the West. They struck 13 health crises, assassinated Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei alongside key officials, military commanders, and many other people. So Israel bombed Iran's assembly of experts while they were in session to elect the next supreme leader. So US and Israel called it Operation Roaring Lion and Operation Epic Fury, but Iran's strategic patience ran out, and in turn it turned into the martyrdom mystic. So the revolutionary Iranian perspective made it unequivocal for everyone. The time for concessions or any trust in traditional fake diplomacy had come to its end. Iran, the vanguard of the axis of the resistance, and today I would say the vanguard of the global South rising, deserves our full solidarity. And it will not be bombed into submission to US Zionist, imperialist, Epstein axis. So the death of Khamenei catalyzed the Iranian people, including the opposition, as we've been following. It mobilized militias in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, in a joint fight for sovereignty, and it will be a relentless one. Within 36 hours, Iran had hit every member of the Gulf Cooperation Council, targeting American assets, striking multiple international airports, at least 3 active ports, crippling international travel and disrupting oil shipments. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 1/5 of the world's oil passes, is effectively closed. US allies saw their peace and alleged protection from the American power reduced into uncertainty and shambles. Bahrain, Iranian missile hit a state-run oil refinery. It struck the US Navy Fifth Fleet, the largest contingent of military people in the world from the US. In Qatar, Iranian missiles go through defenses and hit the airbase, where thousands of US troops were stationed. In Jordan, US military bases were all struck. Dubai, the safe haven of the emergent class without any taste, luxury hotels, civil areas were hit, and fire broke near the US consulate. Kuwait, US soldiers were killed. Oman, Israel, also struck. We're seeing incredible pictures of Tel Aviv, and they are actually the Israeli government or Israeli regime is censoring those footages, and you can go to jail, 5 years in jail if you show the footage of Tel Aviv burning. So historically, the global South has been permanent object of asymmetric power. Sanctions, coups, proxy wars, humanitarian interventions, human rights interventions, economic strangulation, but Iran hit back with enough force, precision to impose costs on the aggression's regional architecture and shaking the psychological premise that US-led power is unchallengeable. Geopolitically, I think Iran rises upon the asymmetric power games all the global South countries have long been subjected to. Iran's response may mark a historical turning point. The global South is rising for sure now.
Thank you for that, Sara. So should we actually go on to question about Iran? If you want to actually ask that question, we might as well get right into it as that intro sort of leads us in.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So, Carlos, we want to know how this whole Iran thing is changing the global order, in your view, and how does it affect China geopolitically as the global South? Does it better for China? Is worse for China? We're seeing a different world from last week. How do you see the pieces moving?
Right. Well, there's a lot of components to this. First thing to say, I fully support what you said in your introduction, that this is another disgusting, criminal, illegal, neo-colonial war with absolutely no justification whatsoever in terms of the principles of natural justice and peace and sovereign equality that everyone can recognize and that are laid down in the United Nations Charter, right? And I think it's right to say that this isn't only a war in Iran. It is obviously a war on Iran, and it's a horrifying war in Iran, which is causing, hundreds and thousands of casualties and obscene levels of destruction. And we've talked about 170 young girls killed in a missile strike, volleyball players. So yeah, it's a war on Iran, but it's also a war on Palestine. Don't forget that Iran is the #1 state backer of the Palestinian resistance and the Palestinian National Project, and has been for decades and decades, right? That's a clear change that happened in 1979 with the Iranian Islamic Revolution. The previous administration under the Shah dictatorship, the Shah tyranny, had been an ally of Israel, an ally of the United States. Immediately from 1979, Iran was converted into a completely solid and consistent supporter of Palestinian national rights, and it has been that for the last 47 years. It's also, as you're kind of alluding to, it's a war on multipolarity, it's a war on China, it's a war on Russia, it's a war on the Belt and Road Initiative. Iran is exceedingly important for the Belt and Road Initiative. Iran is right there in the center in terms of this Eurasian landmass. So all of this connectivity around infrastructure, around telecommunications, around transport, et cetera, that passes through Iran. And Iran and China have a comprehensive strategic partnership. They have an economic deal with a value of something like $100 billion. Iran is a member of BRICS as of a couple of years ago. Iran is a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as of a couple of years ago. So this is very much part of overall an ongoing US strategy of attempting to maintain its hegemony by suppressing the rise of China and suppressing the emergence of a multipolar world order, seizing control of energy flows. By the way, China is the largest importer of Iranian energy and Gulf energy in general, developing strategic choke points. And in many ways, it's part of the same piece. It's part of the overall same geopolitical strategy as this talk of the US colonizing Greenland, or in Venezuela, the capture, the kidnapping, the seizure of President Nicolas Maduro and first combatant Celia Flores. Those are also about controlling energy flows, controlling strategic choke points. So how is, what's going to be the overall impact in the big kind of global political picture? What does this all mean for China's geopolitical position? I mean, I think the first and obvious thing to say is that this Iran war is going to be an absolute disaster for the West. It's going to be an absolute disaster for the United States.
Tell us all about it.
It's going to be an absolute disaster for Israel, right? Imperialism, Zionism are already suffering a massive and unprecedented crisis of legitimacy, right? Countries around the world, and even, included, here in Britain or in the United States, they've lost any kind of faith in the political leadership that exists in the United States, in Europe, in Canada, in Australia. Israel is totally isolated. It's not even a viable political project anymore. Just 3 years ago, Israel had a trajectory towards normalization of some kind, right? They had the Abraham Accords, in which Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates had recognized and established diplomatic relations with Israel. Morocco joined that. Sudan joined that. So and no one was talking about Palestine. So the expectation, the trajectory was towards Israel is a permanent fixture. The Palestinian question is dead. Any talk of boycotting Israel or divesting from Israel is anti-Semitic, and we can't even listen to it. We'll arrest you if you even talk about it. Now, there's none of that. We've got a trajectory not only towards a Palestinian state, but towards a single Palestinian state, towards a one Palestine, one democratic Palestine with equal rights for Muslims, Jews, Christians, non-believers, and so on. No one's going to invest in Israel now. Israel's a pariah. No one's going to go on holiday to Israel. Meanwhile, the United States is hated.
No more kissing walls. No more kissing walls in Jerusalem. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the US is also hated. The US has taken the mask off. Actually, you could argue that the US is not acting very differently to the way it's acted for 80 years, right? Since the end of the Second World War and the start of the Cold War. If you look at what the US has done, be it in Guatemala, be it in Iran in 1953, with the coup against Mohammad Mossadegh, what they did in Korea, what they did in Vietnam, what they did in Yugoslavia, Syria, Libya, that it would take up all the time we've got for me to actually list these US aggressive and illegal interventions over the course of the last 80 years. But now, especially with the Trump regime, and especially in an overall context of declining profitability, a crisis, a chronic crisis of capitalism, they've taken the mask off. And what that looks like is resorting to increasingly kind of unhinged fascistic behavior, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, I'm referring to, these ICE troops, these stormtroopers that they've got on the streets of Minneapolis, that they've got on the streets of Chicago, that they've got on the streets of Los Angeles and other places, rounding up people who were born in different countries. Internationally, it means not paying any attention whatsoever to international law, not even sugarcoating their aggression in terms of protecting human rights or protecting democracy or protecting freedom of speech. There's none of that. They don't bother about that. They just say the United States is going to do what they do. Trump even announced yesterday that he thinks he must be consulted as to who Iran's next supreme leader would be.
No.
Having assassinated, having extrajudicially murdered the supreme leader of the country, Syed Ali Khamenei, now Trump thinks that he gets to choose who the next supreme leader will be. So, the principles of justice, the principles of sovereign equality, principles of United Nations Charter have been thrown in the dustbin. The mask is off. And the same is the case in Britain, the same is the case in Europe. If you look at the popularity rating of the British government, the Starmer government, I think it's in single figures now. Like it's maybe 10% max, right? The popularity rating of the Iranian government is more like 90%. Popularity rating of the Chinese government is more like 95%, right? But in Britain, in France and Germany, Starmer, Macron, Merz, these guys, they're hated. You would never, I couldn't even imagine having a conversation with someone in a shop or at work or in any social context that I might be in, and the person I was speaking to me saying, "Oh, I think the government's doing a good job. I think Keir Starmer's a great prime minister." I mean, it's unimaginable. It wouldn't happen. So, and parallel to that, China's becoming very popular. Even in the West, we got this whole China maxing phenomenon. All these people on TikTok and Instagram and whatnot of, you meet me at a very Chinese time in my life, etc., etc. That's that's partly in contrast to all the crazy stuff, and as I say, the fascistic direction that the West is going in. But it's partly also a manifestation and a reflection of positive things that China's doing. It's its basic orientation towards peace, its adherence to international law and to the United Nations Charter. Obviously, its successes that are increasingly impossible to ignore, right, in terms of poverty alleviation, having conducted the most extensive poverty alleviation program in human history. Its successes in green energy. China produces 60% of all the renewable energy on the planet. Its infrastructure development, its successes improving people's lives. And people can, you've got YouTube influencers going to China and showing people in the West what it's like. So people see this massive contrast, and that's changing. That's changing the game in terms of the legitimacy of imperialism, and I would say is starting to prove the fundamental superiority of socialism, which is another very important, albeit slightly tangentially related question. The war is going to fail. The US, Israel, they want to destroy Iran. They want to install a puppet regime that's pro-West and pro-Israel. And you can just imagine what sort of legitimacy that type of government would have in Iran. They want to destroy the Palestinian resistance. They want to take control of Iran's energy reserves, and they want to enjoy its kind of strategic position. They're not going to achieve any of that. They didn't even achieve that in Iraq, right, in 2003, 23 years ago. And Iran 2026 is not Iraq 2023. But what did they achieve in Iraq? They killed 1 million people. They destroyed a country, but they didn't get what they wanted. They didn't manage to monopolize Iraq's natural resources, its oil wealth. They didn't get control of the country. Ironically, Iraq is one of the main centers of support for Iran now, because what a lot of people don't understand is the majority of Iraq's population is Shia. They have a natural affinity towards the Iranian system, towards the Iranian constitution, and towards its kind of ideological religious basis. Furthermore, and the US, by the way, its military bases in Iraq are suffering huge blows at the hands of various militia groups in Baghdad and elsewhere at the moment. China and Iraq have excellent and growing relations, and to such a point that China's deeply embedded in all of Iraq's infrastructure, including its energy infrastructure. There's literally a saying in Iraq that America bombs, China builds. America bombed our whole country, flattened our cities, killed 1 million of our people. Meanwhile, China comes in. China's built thousands of schools in Iraq. China's built hospitals in Iraq. China's working with the Iraqi government and energy companies on renewable energy, on solar energy, right? This is a country that's known for its oil, for its fossil fuels. That's kind of why it's been the target of so much geopolitical pressure over the course of more than a century. China is engaging with the oil industry, with the fossil fuel industry in Iraq as well, but it's also working with it for the first time to develop renewable energy. So this is absolutely unprecedented. So the US didn't get what they wanted in Iraq, and there's absolutely no way that they're going to get what they want in Iran. And Iran is a proud sovereign country that's going to fight to the bitter end. The most that Israel can do, the most that the US can do, can flatten it, can create massive destruction, right? Can create chaos. The best they could hope for is maybe what they achieved in Libya, right, with a regime change operation, and replace a functioning and a popular and a people-oriented government with anarchy, with death and destruction. But I think there's basically no chance they'll be able to achieve even that. And so, you by contrast, people see China's role in the world. They see its drive towards multipolarity, its commitment to peaceful coexistence, its commitment to non-interference, respect for sovereignty, adherence to international law, mutually beneficial cooperation. That's going to continue winning China friends and allies around the world, right? China wants win-win cooperation. It wants mutual benefit, and that's what everyone else wants. If you take the ruling classes in the United States and Western Europe and Japan out of the picture, everybody in the world in this population of 8 billion wants what China's put on the table. So we're in a very complicated period. We're in a very turbulent period, a period where the US ruling class's strategy is basically the project for a new American century, right? The idea is to project US hegemony from the 20th century into the 21st century. And that's not working, and it can't work. And they're lashing out, they're hitting out in every direction. So it's a very complicated, very difficult time. And they're pursuing their strategy of encirclement and containment of China, which has been going on actually since 1949, since the founding of the People's Republic of China. But there is a inevitable, an overall, and a irreversible trajectory towards multipolarity. And I think that this despicable criminal war in Iran will end up accelerating that process.
I can't avoid a comment when you say Trump thinks he's gonna the new supreme leader, spiritual leader of Iran. Trump, it's not Ukraine. Do you guys remember when in the era Maiden, Victoria Nuland, she was then the US Assistant Secretary of State for the European Eurasian Affairs, in then she was handing out cookies at this Independence Square And it was so ridiculous. And then there were this phone call between Newland and Piat saying, oh, let's put that boxer, Vitaly Klitschko. Do you know that horrible boxer? He used to live in Germany. He barely speak a sentence. And no, it's not. It seems like Trump still thinks it's Ukraine. It's, it's also the lack of sanity, those maniacs.
But in stark contrast, this week we have, of course, the two sessions. China's two sessions, China's biggest annual political meetings commenced on Wednesday. To give the audience some context, the two sessions are the annual meetings of the National People's Congress, NPC, China's roughly 2,900 delegate legislature, and the Chinese People Political Consultative Conference, CPPCC, a political advisory body with about 2,170 representatives. Fun fact, Jackie Chan and Yao Ming were both part of that political advisory body. This year, the emphasis will be on the 15th five-year plan from 2026 to 2030. Carlos, you wrote this book, as we have talked about, so you're probably best positioned, I think, to give us some insight. What are we likely to expect from the two sessions this year?
Well, the two sessions always provide a sort of window into what the priorities and what the direction of China's leadership is particularly in economic terms, but political terms, cultural terms as well. And I just wanted to mention quickly about how these two sessions are presented in the West. If you read the New York Times, or you read CNN, or you read The Guardian, or the Financial Times, or the BBC, I guarantee you'll come across the expression rubber stamp. The two sessions, the National People's Congress and the CPPCC, the Consultative Conference, are just some kind of formality that really, China is a terrible authoritarian dictatorship, and Xi Jinping has just kind of drafted all of these laws himself. And then you have a few thousand representatives come into the Great Hall of the People, and they just have to vote yes, otherwise they'll be in prison for the rest of their lives. That's basically that's basically how the whole thing is presented, right? And yeah, so I'll just say something quickly about that, and because I think it's a good opportunity to go into how Chinese democracy works in general, right? It's certainly true that like at the sessions themselves, there's not a huge amount of disagreement, but that's doesn't reflect the whole process being a formality, because these national events that take place once a year over the course of a couple of days, these are the culmination of a very long process of policy formation, of extensive debate, of extensive consultation involving literally millions of people. Literally millions of people are involved in these conversations, right? So, these sessions of the People's Congress, of the Consultative Conference, these are taking place at a national level, but these bodies also exist at a provincial level, at a city level, at a county level, and a village level, right? So you've got the National Political Council, which is indirectly elected in the sense that it's directed by the level underneath it, the provincial level. And the provincial level is elected by the city level. And then at the county level and the village level, these are directly elected by the populations. And all of these elections have to be, according to the Constitution, they have to be competitive elections, right? And candidates don't have to be members of the Communist Party of China. So when you get down to these lower levels and you're talking about people who engage in like mass meetings and consultation processes and arguments and discussions about how China should be moving forward, how its economy should be progressing over the course of the next year, again, you're talking about millions of people engaging with the democratic process in a very meaningful way. Where I live, no one has any engagement with the democratic process. It's a bourgeois democracy, which means it's the dictatorship of capital. Essentially, what the capitalists want, the capitalists get, right? We call it democracy because we get to vote once every 4 years. As Marx famously commented, bourgeois democracy is where people get to vote every 4 to 5 years for what representatives of the bourgeoisie will oppress them in parliament, right? So China, it's probably surprised some of your audience to hear me say it, but China is fundamentally far more democratic than our Western so-called democracies, and yeah, alongside this, the NPC, the National People's Congress, and that legislative aspect, you also have this quite unique system of consultative democracy, which is a very extensive consultation process with a huge array of stakeholders, with trade unions, with special interest groups, with the China Women's Federation, with groups representing different ethnicities and the different political parties. Another thing most people don't know about China is that it actually has 9 political parties, not one political party. Everyone knows about the CPC, obviously, but there's also the Kuomintang, there's also the Chinese Democratic League, and so on. So yeah, there's a huge number of mechanisms for consultation and feedback, of public consultations and meetings, online surveys and questionnaires, with a very high level of participation. Obviously, the main focus this year is, as you said, the 15th five-year plan, and no doubt, that's going to produce policies that respond to a whole bunch of domestic and external challenges that China faces. Especially, that we've talked about how we're in a very unstable and very unpredictable and fragile global environment, global and regional environment, with the Trump regime really, as I've said, taking the mask off in terms of its approach to international relations. And then, there's the backdrop of the new Cold War, which has been really going on since, I would say, 2011 to some degree, with the Obama-Clinton pivot to Asia, which then escalated with the Trump 1.0 regime, and then again with Biden and the establishment of AUKUS and the reviving of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, and then yet again with Trump 2.0 and the tariff war, Biden's semiconductor war, and now these flagrant illegal activities in relation to Venezuela, in relation to Iran, in relation to Cuba. So the US is working, its whole strategy is predicated around hobbling China's progress and suppressing its rise. So through decoupling, through tariffs, through export controls, through unilateralism, through protectionism, through military encirclement, and through a propaganda war. So I think we can be pretty confident that China's 15th five-year plan is really going to emphasize technological and scientific self-reliance, right? Those are going to assume massive importance, because it's abundantly clear to everyone concerned that China can't rely on the goodwill of the West. It can't rely on the goodwill of Europe. It can't rely on the goodwill of the United States. It was good while it lasted, right? China and US started their rapprochement in 1971 when Henry Kissinger visited Beijing. President Nixon visited a year later, and they established some kind of rapprochement. Bilateral relations were struck under the Carter administration in 1979, and for probably up to 4 decades, things were going reasonably well. There was some symbiosis. A lot of Americans got extremely rich from their engagement with China, and China was able to use that period of relative peace and relatively good relations and favored trading nation status, et cetera, to really develop itself. But it can't rely on that situation anymore. It has to really double down on its self-reliance, especially around semiconductors. Semiconductors are probably the number one technology for determining the future of our economy, right? And the US is really doing everything that it possibly can to prevent China from becoming a leader in that field. So China has to develop and is developing self-reliance in semiconductors. Same with artificial intelligence, same with quantum computing, same with hydrogen energy, same with nuclear fusion, same with advanced telecommunications, 6G mobile communications, and so on. And the other thing is that, in terms of its ecological targets, China's already, by far the world leader, really the only global superpower in terms of renewable energy, in terms of electric vehicles, in terms of biodiversity protection, in terms of forestation, in terms of pollution control, transport electrification, industry electrification, energy efficiency. And so it will be looking to further consolidate those achievements, further expand those achievements. It's going to be moving towards its target of reaching carbon neutrality, so of reaching net zero by 2060. It's already met its 2030 target of peaking carbon emissions. It looks like it reached that target in 2024 or 2025. No doubt there's going to be a military component to the 5-year plan.
Really?
Because China has to protect itself. That's increasingly clear. We're in the middle of what's being called a new Cold War. But Cold Wars are not always cold. The original Cold War wasn't very cold if you're in Korea, or if you're in Vietnam, or if you're in Indonesia, or if you're in Chile, or indeed if you're in Brazil, right? There's no shortage of people that died within a framework of the original Cold War. But I don't think US strategists' end game is a Cold War on China. Their end game is a hot war on China. It's a war to permanently weaken and roll back the Chinese Revolution and potentially break up the People's Republic of China, right? So there will definitely be a military modernization component to the 5-year plan. And one nice thing to just mention is that it's been mooted, and I'm pretty sure it will get to the final document, that the 5-year plan will include reaching an average life expectancy of 80 years, which is really nice. It's currently 79. It just passed the 79 threshold. So they've got part of their planning process that we want to raise this in the next 5 years to 80, which will put China in a very select group of countries in the world, right? And 79 is already good. 79 is already substantially ahead of the United States, which is suffering a declining life expectancy. But I think it says a lot about how Chinese think about developing their economy, that they include a life expectancy component to it, and it comes down to, if you want to get into the Marxism of it, it comes down to the difference between capitalism and socialism. It comes down to the idea of producing for the good of the people and the good of the planet, as opposed to producing for the needs of capital reproduction.
Since you talked about the military budget, I wanted to contextualize this, because as you said, rightly, I assume, I agree with, that US is targeting China in essentially their end game being a hot war. I think it may really surprise people that while Trump is promising a 50% military increase from about 900 billion US dollars to 1.5 trillion US dollars in the US, China is proposing a modest 7% military increase, maintaining a single-digit growth for the 11th consecutive year. This would be the lowest percentage increase since 2021. So in light of this, in light of what you just mentioned, the escalations against China, the apparent attempt to narrow onto China, why this discrepancy in terms of this military increase in their and it is their defense budget?
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that the US isn't getting a lot of bang for its buck in terms of its defense expenditure, right? Like, the US spends all of this money on the military-industrial complex, more or less $1 trillion a year, but it can't win wars. What's going on there? They waged a war against Iran back, last summer, right? In June 2025. Did they win that war? They waged a 12-day war. By the end of it, the US and Israel were absolutely desperate for a ceasefire. They had to go begging to Tehran. So what's the point in spending these trillions when you can't actually fight, when you can't win a war? Look at what's happening in Iran at the moment. Iran is firing off tens of thousands of these cheap drones, these cheap missiles that cost maybe like $3,000-$4,000 each, right? It's peanuts, it's chump change, and they're able to do significant damage to the US forces. And Israel and the US are trying to respond to every little cheap drone that costs $4,000 with a anti-aircraft missile that costs multiple millions of dollars, right? So the US military budget is enormous, but it doesn't necessarily bring a huge amount of military might. It doesn't bring successes. It's feeding into the military industrial complex. I think, if anything, the US's military budget makes sense from some kind of twisted, warped economic point of view. It's like, what used to be called military Keynesianism, that they need to get some investment in the economy, and so they can do that via means of investing in the military industrial complex. It's one of the very few sectors of the US real economy, like the non-financialized economy, actually making things that's doing pretty well, and the Ukraine war has really been sustaining it for the last 4 years. On top of that, obviously, the US has to maintain a whole global system of power projection with its more than 800 overseas bases, its naval fleets, its aircraft carriers, its weapons systems, its troop deployment. They've got 30,000 troops in South Korea. They've got 30,000 troops in Japan, and nuclear-enabled missiles and warplanes in those places, in Guam, in Australia, in Okinawa, all around the West Asian region. All of these bases in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, in Kuwait, in Qatar, and places like that are receiving a battering, mashallah, from Iranian forces right now. That's all extremely costly, and China doesn't need all that. China can save money. Better to spend, if you've got resources, better to spend them feeding your people, right? Better to spend them on renewable energy. Better to spend them on improving your people's welfare. China's not an imperialist power. It will never be an imperialist power. Its military posture is purely defensive. It's I think you could describe it as a kind of minimalist defensive strategy, right? It's focused on protecting its sovereignty, it's focused on protecting its territorial integrity, and it's focused on deterring aggression. China's a nuclear power. It's been a nuclear power since 1964, but the whole focus of that is on maintaining a reasonable nuclear deterrent, right? China's got maybe 500 nuclear warheads compared to the US's, I think, 5,500. And China is also the only nuclear power to have a policy of no first use. So China has a constitutional guarantee that it would never use nuclear weapons except in retaliation for a nuclear strike against it, right? And it's got a constitutional guarantee that it would never use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear country. So that means it will never engage in nuclear bullying, right? And further, and if every nuclear country had a policy of no first use, we would live in a much, much safer world. Unfortunately, it's only China who's really taken the lead on that. China has advanced anti-missile systems, it's got advanced monitoring systems, it's got advanced intelligence capability, but it's got no intention of being drawn into a costly arms race. The Soviet Union was, for a combination of reasons, it was basically forced into keeping up with the United States, right, on military spending. And that contributed to the very serious economic problems that it faced, particularly in the 1980s. And that was part of a quite explicitly enunciated strategy by the Carter and by the Reagan regimes in the United States from the late 70s onwards. That caused huge problems in the Soviet Union, and China doesn't want those problems. An arms race is okay for a country like the US. An arms race is okay for a capitalist neoliberal country, right? At least a section of the capitalist class does well out of it. Like we've just been talking about the $1 trillion budget in the military budget in the US and how that feeds into the military industrial complex. So, some people are doing well out of it. The tech companies do very well out of it, of course, because Anthropic and OpenAI and Microsoft and Google and all of these guys are, have been in bed with the Pentagon and the Department of Defense for a very long time. But for a socialist country, an arms race is just an utter waste of resources, that you want to spend on improving people's lives. The other thing is, China maybe doesn't need the same level of military expenditure because it's inserted itself very deeply into the global economy. You know, China is the #1 trading partner of literally 3/4 of the countries in the world. You know, it's a huge trading partner for all the regional countries. It's actually a huge trading partner for the US. So any aggressive military action against China would actually have like severe economic repercussions for whoever was waging that aggression. So like the cost of going to war against China is very high. Diplomatically, China is in a very strong position. It's got good relations with the vast majority of its neighbors. You know, it's like, if you look at it from a geographical point of view, it's a pretty fragile situation. You know, China's got 14 land borders, but you know, it has great relations with Russia. It has great relations with Mongolia, with Pakistan, with North Korea, with South Korea, with Vietnam, with Laos, with all the Central Asian republics. And so it doesn't have the benefit of the US's geographic positioning. You know, as the US military used to say, you know, the US's greatest allies are the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, right? You know, US is almost untouchable from a geostrategic point of view. But China, you know, China doesn't have those advantages, but China's much smarter. So, you know, China's not complacent, and it's definitely recognized, as I said, when we were talking about the 15th five-year plan, that military modernization is essential. It's a project that's in progress and will continue to move forward. But China's really focused on developing the minimum necessary for self-defense.
Just because we are running out of time, but I did want to ask you this question here, because we're seeing from Western media reports that China has set the lowest growth target in over 30 years as economy feels a strain. And I think this is echoes of the whole Gordon Chang, China is collapsing, China is about to collapse type of thing. But could you put this in perspective for us?
Yeah, I mean, first should be obvious thing to say is that a growth target of 4.5 to 5% isn't that low. I think the vast majority of countries in the world would be pretty happy if you said, well, would you sign up for growth of 4.5% this year? I think nearly every country, you know, probably every country with the exception of India would say, yes, please, that'd be ideal. So yeah, in comparison with what you had in China in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, yeah, like 5% is relatively low. But you know, in the 90s, they were starting from a very, very low base, and there was a clear need for this sustained quantitative growth, right? Producing more in order to meet people's most basic needs, right? In a situation where people's housing needs weren't really met, when like literally hundreds of millions of people over the course of, you know, a couple of decades moved from the countryside to the cities, like the largest kind of long-term migration in human history, and the most rapid urbanization process in human history. Obviously, you know, the amount of physical infrastructure, the number of actual physical things that you needed to support that was enormous, and that was kind of the basis for these kind of dizzying rates of growth that you saw in the Chinese economy in the 1990s and early 2000s, of up to, you know, 14-15% and whatnot. So, you know, that was about producing more, creating jobs, building homes, building that very basic infrastructure. But that level of GDP growth is not actually sustainable in the long term. And the focus now is much more on what they call high quality growth. It's about improving people's living standards. It's about respecting and improving the environment. So, you know, the environment has become a hugely important consideration in Chinese planning now. You can't get any kind of plan approved without environmental considerations and without understanding and explicitly enunciating and stating the way in which it fits in with the country's overall plan for environmental conservation and for reaching its climate change goals. The focus now is much more on improving social welfare. It's on developing high technology. China, even just 20 years ago, was considered a place that produced low quality goods, right? It produced toys and it produced T-shirts, for us to wear on the streets of London, and New York, etc., etc. It was, people talked in a disparaging way about things that are produced in China. If a label says "made in China," that was like a way of saying, well, it's not good quality, it's cheap. Whereas that's completely transformed, right? China has moved a long way up the value chain to the point where it's now a global leader in like some of the most important areas of science and technology. The focus is much more on innovation. It's much more on upgrading industrial structure. So, China's growth has been slowing for quite a few years now, but in my view, it's not actually a sign of crisis. It's not the coming collapse of China. It's a sign of maturity. And while growth has been relatively slower in the last decade compared to the previous decade, nonetheless, China is like, if you look at China now in 2026 and compare it to China in 2016 or 2006, so 10 years before that, China's seen massive changes that are maybe not really reflected in pure GDP growth figures. Like if you look, the living standards are incomparably higher. The level of technology, as I talked about, is incomparably higher. In terms of science, China's now the research center of the world. Like I must, every day that I look at South China Morning Post and other newspapers, I see, so-and-so top scientist is leaving the US or is leaving Europe and is going to Tsinghua University or is going to Wuhan Normal University or is going to University of Hong Kong or whatever, because that's where the highest level of research is taking place. As we've said, China's unsurpassed on green energy. It's unsurpassed on reducing pollution of the air, reducing pollution of the land, reducing pollution of the waters, and creating a more favorable, a more enjoyable living, and a more sustainable living environment for the people. They've had this huge focus on corruption. There was a time 20, 30 years ago, you couldn't get anything done in China without, paying some little bribe here and there, whereas that's been transformed. Well, which makes a huge difference to people's lives, right? When corruption doesn't come into play, and economic activity falls within a framework of socialist legality, people by and large have better jobs than they used to. There's less inequality. China still has significant inequality, but it's one of the few countries in the world where the level of inequality is reducing, and it's being reduced in a very kind of systematic and deliberate way. Social welfare is improving. Pensions are being rolled out across the whole country. Health insurance has been rolled out across the whole country. Everyone has access to health insurance, right? Education system is improving, like the free universal education and those 10 mandatory years of free education that you get are improving, along with the higher end, the top universities. China has some of the top universities in the world now and some of the best science, some of the best research. The infrastructure is transformed. China's got 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, like 2/3 of all the high-speed rail in the world. China's got 98% of the electric buses in the world. It's got this unbelievable electric vehicle charging infrastructure. People can get around in China. And meanwhile, the government has very purposefully, very slowly, very carefully burst the real estate bubble, which was causing real problems. As a result, the housing situation is becoming much better. It's becoming much more stable. And another thing most people don't know, 90% of Chinese own their own homes. And the vast majority of those, they don't even have a mortgage, right? They own it outright. What a joy. What level of safety is that? What level of freedom is that, to think that you're not constantly at the whim of your landlord, etc., etc. And it's incredibly rare. You can walk around Beijing, you can walk around Guangzhou, you can walk around Shanghai, Xi'an for hours and hours. It would be incredibly unusual to see anyone homeless, to see anyone living on the street, right? So these things, to me, are more interesting, more important than this headline GDP growth rate figure. The US has seen respectable growth in this period. Maybe it's more like, if China's at 5% growth, the US is more like 3% growth. It's certainly better than Europe. I mean, here in Britain, I think our baseline growth rate is approximately 1%. But Are people living better in the United States than they were 20 years ago? No. No way. Like life expectancy is in decline. Wealth disparity is increasing. Poverty is increasing. Desperation is increasing. That is very much not the case in China. So, GDP isn't everything. GDP measures economic output, right? And it's a coarse measure, even of that. It's not a very reliable measure of economic output. But that doesn't say anything about the quality of the output. It doesn't say anything about the distribution of wealth. It doesn't say anything about the well-being of the population, the state of the environment, or any number of other factors that are frankly much more important to people's lives. Meanwhile, like 4.5 to 5% growth, as I said, it's not bad. In Britain, like if we had a GDP growth rate in Britain of 5%, that would be a dream. Maybe the Starmer government would be a bit more popular than it is.
Carlos, what you're saying is that the capital metrics are absolutely poor and insufficient to translate socialist parameters like growth, like equality. It's about equality, right? If you see Brazil is one of the largest economy in the world and has one of the poorest population. It's a very rich country, but it's unequal. And I mean, if we keep looking at the world with this capital metrics, we will miss out on what we actually want to achieve.
Yeah. Well, Samir Amin, the Egyptian Marxist economist who died a couple of years ago, said something. He made that exact same comparison, and he made this comparison probably 20 years ago. He said, China's a poor country with no poor people. You can drive around China for a very long time. You won't see people starving. Brazil, on the other hand, is a rich country with a massive poor population.
Exactly.
So João's in the studio, which is very exciting, but we do have one question before we get to João's question. I just really want to ask it because it is an important one. It is about the Kenyan communist leader, the imprisonment of the Marxist Party of Kenya leader, Booker Omole. Now, you did meet Booker Omole 2 years ago, and I have to say that the Communist Marxist Party of Kenya in Kenya is legally registered, but it struggles to even meet the threshold for the state funding, which requires like 5%. So it doesn't even have 5% of the vote. And yet Booker Omole was imprisoned, he was tortured. Here we have this X video of him being granted bail, but this is certainly not finished. And I don't think we have time to actually play the entire video because it's 4 minutes. But Carlos, can you give us your insight into the CMPK's political position, an update on Booker Omole's case, and why this disproportionate crackdown?
For sure. I mean, Booker Omole, as you stated, General Secretary of the Communist Party of Marxist Kenya. I've known him for quite a long time. My co-editor on Friends of Socialist China, Keith Bennett, who you've had on the show, met him, I think it was at the World Socialism Forum in Beijing back in 2023. He came to London in 2024, like literally 2 years ago. He got in touch with us. We did a very lovely, packed, spirited public meeting at Marx Memorial Library about China-Africa relations. Booker spoke alongside other people that I think you've had on the show, including Roger McKenzie from the Morning Star, Fiona Sim from Black Liberation Alliance, Alex Gordon, who was then RMT president and is now General Secretary of the Communist Party of Britain, and Radhika Desai. So, yeah, the CPKM is like, it's a small party, but it's a growing party. It's rapidly gaining traction amongst working class and especially youth forces in Kenya. It's a highly principled, highly energetic, highly creative Marxist-Leninist organization with great communication skills. I mean, if you look on YouTube at some of the Kenyan communist rappers, so it's amazing. It's an absolute joy to watch. Booker himself is a very charismatic, very inspiring leader. And I think what they're managing to do is to consolidate a grassroots movement in Kenya against what is essentially a puppet regime of the US and of Britain, And let's not forget that Kenya was a colony of Britain, and Britain has a lot to answer for in terms of the current state of affairs in that country. So you're talking about a movement for sovereignty, a movement for national dignity, for social justice, for workers' rights, for an end to imperialist exploitation, and for alignment with the global South, right? For solidarity with China, for solidarity with Palestine, for solidarity with Iran. Actually, one of Booker's last speeches before he was incarcerated, before he was essentially kidnapped, was specifically standing in solidarity with Iran. And therefore, this puppet regime in power in Nairobi is responding with extreme repression, illegal detention, torture, trumped up charges, and denial of the most basic human rights. But as the Guinean leader Sekou Touré once said, if the enemy is not attacking you, you're not doing anything. So what we're seeing is a manifestation of the Communist Party of Kenya Marxist doing something, and doing something that is very alarming, very scary, very worrying to the puppet regime and to its backers in London, to its backers in Washington. So also we start to see the limits of so-called capitalist democracy, right? It's only democratic when it's not scared. So it's great that you brought it up on the show, and it's essential that we spread knowledge about what's happening to Booker. He's been a political prisoner, a prisoner of conscience, and we need to have a global campaign in his support.
Thank you so much for that, Carlos. We have João in the studio. I'm going to let him in. He has a question for you, Carlos, so please stick around. But let me introduce, and I apologize because I still don't know how to say your name. João Amorim is a Brazilian-American filmmaker, producer, and animator focused on social and environmental storytelling from the perspective of the Global South. So it is only fitting that he is our new co-host on Global South Rising. We are introducing this next hour after our question with Carlos, where we have a little bit of a different format. So, stay and check that out. But welcome, João, to Global South Rising.
Hi, Ileana, Sara. How are you guys? It's a pleasure to be here. Carlos, it's great to be able to hear you speak. And I have a question for you that links up to some of the subjects that I'll be talking about. And it has to do with digital colonialism. So there's a lot of critiques on how US tech corporations expend their power through data control and through platform governments. What do you think are concrete steps that the Global South countries can take to build sovereign digital infrastructure? And how can independent media like this, for instance, support this struggle?
Thanks very much, João, and prazer en conhecê-lo. It's really interesting that you bring this up, and digital colonialism is a very important concept and something that's not widely understood. And it's essential that people know about how this digital realm is a key site of imperial control and exploitation. And it's something that, in a sense, the world has sort of just let happen over the course of the last maybe 30 years, right? People don't realize that the internet was originally developed as a military project by DARPA, by the United States, and then has been commercialized in a way that's allowed US, in particular, tech giants to dominate the digital landscape, right? So companies like Google, like Microsoft, like Apple, like Facebook, like Twitter or X or whatever you call it, they've got enormous power over the flow of information, the collection and control of data. And as an aside, and we talked about this briefly earlier in relation to Iran, it's worth noting that all of these companies, literally all of them, are deeply entwined with the US state, including the military, including intelligence agencies. And the war in Iran, the genocide in Palestine, have both been waged and enabled with the help of these companies, through the use of artificial intelligence in the military, in surveillance, in data collection, in censorship, and so on. So The problem we've got at a global level is that most countries don't actually have the resources. They don't have the capability, the capacity to build their own digital infrastructure. And so they're forced to rely on US companies. It's like they don't have any choice. There are some exceptions to that, right? China, I would argue, kind of leads the way. And China's Great Firewall is criticized because China blocks off access to Google, to Facebook, and to a number of other big US tech corporations. So that's criticized in the West as a violation of the basic principles of freedom of speech, right? In my personal and maybe controversial view, it's an extremely positive thing, right? It's indispensable for protecting China's sovereignty, and it's also provided a space for the development of China's own very vibrant domestic tech industry. And when now, if you go to China and you've got WeChat and you've got Alipay and you've got Baidu and you've got Tencent and so on, you don't need, nobody actually needs Google or Facebook or Twitter, etc. So you can do all the things that you want to do online. Individuals can, organizations can, and they don't have to stream their data directly to the Pentagon or to US intelligence agencies. Russia also has its own digital ecosystem. Iran, to a significant degree, has its own digital ecosystem, and that's, to be honest, one of the reasons why it's so hated. But clearly, not every poorer country can just develop its own systems, its own digital infrastructure, but they can work together, and they're helped in that by the fact that most of the Chinese systems operate on an open source basis. For example, DeepSeek, which was publicly launched, I think, just over a year ago. DeepSeek's algorithms and its training models are open source, right? And there's lots of uses, lots of important and valid uses for a large language model like DeepSeek or like ChatGPT or Claude Code or whatever. They can be used in scientific applications and so on. So any country in the world would have a legitimate interest in developing large language models and in using them. But why on earth would any country in the global south choose OpenAI or choose Anthropic or choose Google or choose Facebook or choose X when A, they have to pay for those systems, B, they're closed source systems, so they can't adapt them and for their own needs. With DeepSeek's code, you can, as a developer in Mali or wherever you are, you can just check the code out, inspect it, read every line of it, modify it to your own purposes, and deploy it and use it, right? And C, another reason not to use OpenAI, etc., is that your data is going to be streamed directly to Washington. So the fact that China is operating on an open source basis mainly provides a lot of opportunities for the rest of the world. And I think that's a very important development. As for what independent media can do, I think the important thing for now is, let's push forward these types of conversations, including taking part in global collaboration with other platforms doing similar things, sharing knowledge, sharing expertise, working with people who are working on other platforms, for example, Bilibili, WeChat, and so on. But yeah, there's no magic wand, no formula there. We need to, as the Chinese say, cross the river by feeling the stones.
Oh, beautiful. Everyone is muted.
Huh?
Everyone was muted all of a sudden.
Everyone is muted. Yeah, no, that's I share a lot of those points you brought up. In fact, about 2 weeks ago, there was India AI Impact Summit that happened, and for the first time, major global AI forum was hosted in a country of the global south. Shifting a little bit the geography debate from Silicon Valley or Brussels to New Delhi. And that by itself is already very interesting. And President Lula was there. He attended this conference. And I think his main warning at the summit is very aligned with what you said, Carlos. Is what he said was, when few when few people control the algorithms and the digital infrastructures, we're not talking about innovation, but by talking about domination, right? So it has totally has a lot to do with that. And as a filmmaker, and I've been working and using AI, and I'm not against it. There's a lot of purists that are against it, and I think that AI is somehow here to stay, independent of the bubble that might burst as far as the US AI. But as you said, it can be used to, and not just to, for silly videos on social media. It can be used to resolve a lot of complex issues that we have. For instance, climate change, right? In China, as you mentioned, they're using AI to design better windmills. So there's a lot that can be done there. And we just, I think, need to learn how to use these tools better. I think one of the things that I would like to bring up about Lula's speech in India, so that we can discuss it, it has to do with the concentration of power. Right now, computational capacity, the infrastructure, and the capital remains concentrated in the hands of a small number of countries and companies, and the data that is generated by these people and institutions in the global South is completely appropriated by foreign conglomerates, without any equivalent return in value for these territories. So one of the things that is at stake is what some people might call censorship, but we call it regulation. And we've been talking about this in Brazil since Lula's second mandate, so for a long time, which is the regulation of media. And everybody says, this regulation of media is censorship, right? So is regulating big tech's, censorship? Or are we avoiding innovation as they claim? Or are we safeguarding human rights in the digital sphere? Because in Brazil now we have a lot of issues with teenagers and violence towards women that is being disseminated in the social networks. So right now we don't have a regulation for that applies to social networks, that applies to AI in Brazil. So it's kind of like no man's land, and this is one of the points that and no rules, so you can do whatever. In 5 minutes, a teenage kid can find a video on how to commit suicide or this absurd stuff. It's really, I have teenage kids, so I know the size of the drama. So this is one of the things that he brought up, and many of these industries have as their business model essentially data extraction, and sensationalism. So it's either data extraction and distraction. The other thing that I think is important to bring that was talked about in this AI conference is about multilateralism, and Brazil is a big advocate, for a UN-led global AI governments, rather that right now, it's basically the rule of these corporations is imposed on us. So as it is right now, for instance, in Brazil, the government has, large deals with companies such as Google. The majority of the population in Brazil is using as an AI ChatGPT. Recently, this week, there has been a very strong movement, though, when Sam Altman confirmed that he was sharing our data with the U.S. government. The Quit ChatGPT is like a worldwide movement, and I'd like to all of our listeners to endorse and quit and uninstall ChatGPT if they actually still have it, and move to one of the open source platforms that Carlos brought up, right? So there's plenty of them being developed in China, in India as well, in Russia, but also in Brazil. In Brazil, we have a good language model called Talk for writing. So if we have any Brazilian listeners, I invite you to look for the platforms that we are developing locally. I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that, or should I continue?
Well, I have a question about the AI summit in New Delhi. It's called the India AI Impact Summit in New Delhi. How much do you think was incorporated by this? I'm going to put this up here, the Chinese Global AI Governance Action Plan, because a lot of the points that you've raised already in terms of multilateralism, in terms of sovereignty, in terms of really sort of, for lack of a better word, human rights, is actually in this global governance plan, which is only 13 quick points. But it just to give the audience just a sense of this, although I should put this link in the chat, they talk here about jointly seizing the opportunities of AI, and that they also talk about promoting the innovative development of AI, advancing AI empowerment across industries, accelerating digital infrastructure construction, creating a diverse, open, and innovative ecosystem. And, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but essentially it really is about risk assessment, preserving sort of like country. Something is being hit. But basically, it also takes into account that smaller global South countries might not have access to the same type of technologies that the imperialist countries have, for example.
I don't know if Carlos wants to comment that.
Yeah, I would just just to check. Like, do you guys want me to leave the chat at some point?
I mean, I think for sure, please feel free to leave after this segment, but I think your input would be really great, this, because
that's really interesting. I just wanted to just chime in on a couple of issues that João brought up. And there's a lot to pick up, a lot of threads to pick up, a lot to unpack. Just in terms of regulation and regulation of big tech, in my view, that's absolutely essential. That's not even a question, right? It's indispensable. Let me kind of add some nuance to that, because I live in an imperialist country where regulation of big tech is actually this strange contradiction, because the government, the organizations that are doing the regulating, represent the interests of the same people that own these big tech companies and these media companies, right? And these companies just want to make as much profit as possible with absolutely no regard for how they're affecting society, like you say, with the rise of violent misogyny and the rise of any number of backward, racist, prejudiced ideas, etc. The companies will push those, because if it means more clicks, that means more advertising revenue, that means more screen time, etc. But the government represents those companies, so the question of regulation becomes a lot more complicated, and it becomes tied up with the issue of surveillance and censorship, and the government actually preventing progressive and anti-imperialist messages from getting out. So that's its own issue, right? I think in an imperialist country, the issue of regulation, it needs a more sensitive and nuanced approach. In a non-imperialist country, in the global South, regulation is indispensable. You cannot do without it, just in terms of protecting your sovereignty and preventing unconstrained profiteering, right? I mean, the media landscape in Brazil I don't know a huge amount about it, and it's not my place to tell you as Brazilians, but it's insane, right? Where you've got 90% of the media owned by like a handful of families who are pro-imperialist, anti-worker, anti-indigenous, anti-Lula, anti-environment, anti-Amazon rainforest, pro-Israel, pro-Zionist. The idea that they wouldn't be regulated, and the idea that they would be able to spread their viciously reactionary ideas on behalf of a 0.1% layer of the population who happen to be extremely rich, it beggars belief, and seems to me to be an outstanding problem that still needs to be solved in Brazil. And the same goes for regulating tech companies. How can people of the global south, how can countries of the global south allow Amazon and Google and OpenAI and Microsoft and Anthropic to have control of their data? That's you wouldn't give up your sovereignty. You wouldn't say, okay, the state of Minas Gerais, we'll give it over to the United States. We'll give it over to Washington D.C. So we can't do that with our digital sovereignty either. That's it.
I just want to also just acknowledge some of the commenters who are saying here, life does not, thank you, Ode, John Trudeau, life does not require AI. AI is not a force for good. And Shrashta saying, amongst other things, AI is the greatest threat to labor. And I just want to put out this talking point here because, in my opinion, it's not AI that's the greatest threat to labor, it's imperialism. And the problems we have with AI is imperialism. But I'm throwing that out. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think you're right about, the problem is not AI. I think there's a huge movement, even in the left, that is like, okay, let's not use AI. It's an evil tool of the empire, right? Meanwhile, the empire is using it, right? So are we going to fight the empire with cave paintings? It's tricky. I think technology is here to be embraced and used appropriately. Like Carlos, very clearly put, technology behind Facebook and this original social networks was developed by DARPA, and for people who don't know that, DARPA is closely linked to the Secret Service in the US. So it's, basically serving as a link to create, monitor us more and more. And I think a huge damage was done with the social networks, worldwide, and definitely in countries of the global south. I can speak of Brazil. People are totally addicted to social networks, and they're using, the Zuckerberg social network, and they're using, Sam Altman's AI. So we're giving our data away, right? So there's two different things, and there's obviously also, I'm an environmentalist, and there is also a question of AI's use of energy and of water consumption. And I think those are all pertinent points. But I think it's very important that we don't position ourselves as in this place where, AI is the source of all problems, and we should just, not have AI, because it's not going to happen. Right? I don't know if Carlos agrees with me. No, it's not. We're not going to be able to just stop it, and certainly we're not going to be able to stop the right wing from using it and create the deep fakes and create all these narratives that serve empire. And taking back to what you guys were talking about earlier, as far as Iran goes, I mean, right before the bombing happened, we had the month before, and you can search those numbers, an amazing increase in talks about human rights violations in Iran. And look, I don't want to have any, evaluate if the Iranian regime respects or not women. I think that's, it certainly has a lot of issues, and but I believe in sovereignty, and I believe that people need to be sovereign, and if they want to change a regime, they should change it by their own hands and not by the hand of an external impositive power, right? So what's very interesting, bringing it back to what you said about Iran. So it's like I saw, like in the past weeks, and a lot of people that are close to me, posting a lot of stuff again around women's rights, and maybe a week later they were bombing it. So this is, how the social media soft power, but also AI controls, what the status quo believes, right? So it's like, this is an evil power. They're terrible to women. There's a lot of human rights violations, and we need that oil, by the way, right? So this is, and I think for instance, in Brazil, we're going to have elections now this year, right? And there's a big concern about, the use of deep fakes. We got to a stage where now you can make, someone's voice and someone's image perfect, and where, it's very hard to distinguish from something that is not real. So, people need to have a lot of discernment when they're looking at stuff, and they don't, they don't because, people don't trust traditional media anymore. I think it's a worldwide phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And they choose to get informed by the groups that are close to them. And where are those groups? For instance, in a lot of the countries of the global south, WhatsApp, Instagram, TikTok, so it's in the social networks. And so not only are we affected by what these networks want us to believe, we're also giving all the information away. So if we're thinking we're doing any strategic planning there, we need to think again. I think, a big proof, and I talked to Sara about that. It's really amazing, and it's very hard to understand how, for instance, Brazilian officials use WhatsApp to communicate.
Lula is using WhatsApp in his communication.
Yeah, that's how they do. Everyone. Yeah. So it's like, and we know for a fact, because of Assange, that, during, Lula's second government and Dilma's first mandate, the US government was spying on Brazil. But we were giving it all away. I mean, we're using Gmail and we're using WhatsApp. So there's certain measures that are, in my view, simple. And I don't understand why they're not taken. So you talked about the Chinese Great Firewall. I agree with you. That's why they are where they are. Instead of doing like the stupid TikTok dances like our teenagers are doing,
they also have good TikTok dances. They have great Douyin dances. They have robots even that dance.
Yeah, exactly. They also have all of that. So they also have they value science, and they value how technology advances and how AI can use for robotics to help the elder. And here it's just about the dances, right? It's okay to entertain ourselves a little bit.
You don't know Brazil. People spend hours and hours watching those dances.
Watching and memorizing how to do them.
Yeah.
So is that what how we should be dealing with our youth and with the regulation? I mean, recently, for instance, smartphones were prohibited in schools in Brazil, which I understand, and to a certain extent, I agree. But on the other hand, China is teaching AI to kids, starting age of 7. So is the phone the evil thing? Is the AI the evil thing? Or as Ileana put it, it's how empire is using it that is the root of evil. Because, sure, I don't believe kids should use AI for everything and just throw their homeworks there and okay, it's done. There's already like studies and that show, how that's decreasing their cognitive abilities and all that. But at the same time, I don't think it's by, going back to the comment again, saying like, no, AI is the root of all evil. Let's not use it, and let's go back to caves and, grow our own food.
So I'm gonna make this distinction and then throw it onto Carlos. Yeah, can I just say this? I just want to make the really clear distinction that there is a difference between China's use of AI, the way that they fundamentally see AI, and the way that the West is using AI. Like you said, a lot of indoctrination, brainwashing, spying, surveillance, war machine type of AI type of thing. And also the other AI, which is like, it's supposed to be your therapist, your girlfriend, your wife. It's supposed to do all the things that we actually want to do, like create art. It's a ridiculous sort of fantastical concept of AI, and this is largely because of the financialized model of AI. It's really it's promising the world mainly just to gather funds for their $7 trillion budget or whatever they want, for the AI. It's propping up the US economy, but the China sees it very, very differently. And this is where I'd like Carlos to come in here and explain what the differences are in terms of China's approach to AI.
Yeah, thanks very much. Really interesting discussion, and we're kind of moving outside my core competencies a little bit. But I think what João said was all really important, and I think this question really sums everything up. Like, is the phone the evil thing? Is AI the evil thing? And my answer, maybe a bit predictably, as a old-fashioned and unreconstructed Marxist-Leninist, is that no, the phone isn't the evil thing. Capitalism's the evil thing. Imperialism is the evil thing, right? And I've seen some comments in relation to uses of AI in the chat. My view is, I'm more kind of AI optimistic than most people probably, because I think there's a lot of very valid and very important potential uses for AI beyond dancing, which I've got literally no problem with. Entertainment is important too, right? But AI could drive forward unprecedented improvements in medical research, in drug development, medical imaging. It's already being used for example, like a classic use case is what's called tumor tissue delineation. So if you take a scan, determining what part of the scan is a cancer tumor and what part of the scan is regular tissue. So then you know where to direct your radiotherapy treatment, et cetera, et cetera. That's great. If AI can help us with that, if computers can do that work for us better than we can do it ourselves, what's not to like? Why wouldn't you take up those type of opportunities? As João mentioned, AI can be very important in climate modeling, environmental monitoring, developing energy efficiency, improving agriculture. It could help us get to carbon neutrality faster, right? It could help us get to viable nuclear fusion faster. Nuclear fusion potentially, theoretically, could solve humanity's energy problems on a permanent basis and be completely sustainable and have no negative byproducts. But there's a joke in the scientific community and in the environmental community about nuclear fusion that it's always 30 years away. With AI, with the help of algorithms, it could be an awful lot closer than that, and so on, right? But when the technology is controlled by US corporations, reality, we're talking by like a handful of billionaires, by Elon Musk and by Sam Altman, by et cetera, then those are not the uses that we're going to be emphasizing, because they're not the profitable uses. When the technology is directed towards profiteering, towards war, towards surveillance, towards censorship, towards data collection and so on, then we're only going to see the negative aspects of it. So it's not actually a technology problem, it's a systemic problem. And to solve these problems, we need to get the technology out of the hands of these companies and into the hands of the people.
Very well said. Thank you so much, Carlos. I think Sara, do you have anything else I know you were trying to say
Well,
something.
I think you guys covered so much, but I think when we talk about AI, we forget that AI, there is humans behind it. And I think my problem is Elon Musk behind it. It's the Utah black box collecting our data without our knowledge, and the human behind it. The technology itself is just technology. It's about seeing things in their context. Text without context is always a problematic analysis. Let's take a very interesting example, which I think it's very illustrative, is Einstein. So Einstein developed E is equal mc square, which is the theoretical basis for nuclear energy release. Is a paradigm change in the whole way we see the world. He brought so many philosophical questions about the universe, about energy, things that weren't visible for us then. Einstein did a revolution. Then it comes to the wrong hands, and you prompt the US government to fund nuclear research. That's this Einstein Zilat's letter. I don't know how to pronounce this in English. So I think it's much more the humans behind technology itself. It's just technology. Or let's take an example. Medicine by Cuban doctors is one medicine. Medicine by Brazilian capitalist doctors is something else. So I would say it's the human behind it, and as Carlos put it so well, is the capital. When Karl Marx wrote the book, he didn't say the capitalists. He said the capital is the whole logic moving it. And as long as we have this logic behind it, we'll have a world where everybody thinks equally, everybody watches the same things in Netflix, everybody asks the same question in AI. There is really a problem there. Yeah. So that's my point. But yeah, nothing much more.
I think we're pretty much in agreement here. One last thing from the comments. AI data centers require massive amounts of water. And I would say that, China has figured out a solution for that. They put the data centers under the water. Because the water is basically being used to cool down the data centers. That's what is causing the massive amounts of water. Now, not that this is like, okay, this is the problem solved, we're done. Obviously, it's going to cause a rise in water temperatures, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the main point here that we're all sort of discussing is that if you have an overall view of the betterment for the world or the betterment of the people versus just profit, then you're more likely to find solutions that will actually help everyone and not just destroy the entire planet. So can we let Carlos go on that wonderful note?
Thank you, Carlos, for bearing with us here. Three people that can talk a lot.
Thank you, Carlos. Obrigado.
Thank you. And you introduced someone else who can talk too much as well, which is me. Anyway, thanks, guys. Great seeing you all. A privilege to be on the show. See you again soon.
Thank you.
Ciao, obrigado.
Bye. Okay, brilliant. So we are going to be moving on to Sara's watch. This segment is what I was trying to say and trying to introduce. We've just done Zhao's watch. Actually, we're gonna continue with this, even though it didn't quite work. But we're continuing with this show. And now, Sara, what is on your watch this week?
So on my watch is the disgusting reaction of the leaders on Iran. The world leaders. It's so difficult to call them world leaders. Don't you think, guys? Call Macron a world leader, Sturm a world leader, German Chancellor Merz. I haven't seen a more pathetic figure than Merz. Merz went to China. And he was absolutely astonished by China robots. And he goes back in Germany and say, I know everybody in Germany is working a lot, but we need to work more. I mean, he didn't understand the socialist logic behind it. He thinks he needs to apply more of the same failure into German society. But we've seen the different reactions. We saw in the United Nations, the Antonio Guterres condemning the escalation, explicitly referencing the use of force by the United States and Israel against Iran. But also, I think is the most disgusting thing is that this joint German, UK, France reaction. So when Iran was being bombed, was everything fine? But when Iran fired back so successfully after warning over warning, they called on Iran to refrain, and we're talking German Merz, the German chancellor, was calling wahllos. It means indiscriminate attacks from Iran.
Die harten iranischen Gegenschläge die Region noch ziehen werden. Die Sorgen Partner in Irans unmittelbarer Nachbarschaft am Golf und in Europa nehmen wir sehr ernst. Wir fordern losen Angriffe sofort zu beenden. Wir wissen nicht, in welche Eskalation die harten iranischen Gegenschläge die Region noch ziehen werden. Die Sorgen unserer Partner in Irans unmittelbarer Nachbarschaft am Golf und in Europa nehmen wir sehr ernst. Wir fordern Teheran deshalb auf, diese wahllosen Angriffe sofort zu beenden. Wir wissen nicht, in welche Eskalation die harten iranischen Gegenschläge die Region noch ziehen werden.
Sorry about that. I did not mean
to. So the same Macron, you know, the same Keir Starmer, when Iran is bombed unprovoked, it's okay. If 160 girls are victimized because the Western is liberating women in Iran by killing them, it's okay. But once Iran strikes back, it becomes a disproportionate response. It becomes a vicious attack and justifying military escalation, more of the same again. But, you know, let me remember, you know, I have a link there. I don't know if you can pick it up. Ileana, please, would be so kind. Macron, let's remember what Macron was writing to Trump not a long time ago. Not a long time ago, Macron was sending we had a leakage of a conversation between Macron and, I'm just trying to find this here, Macron and, do you have it? Okay, I found it.
I have it.
Let's see here. So what we have here, Macron saying, from President Macron to President Trump, my friend, we are totally in line on Syria. Okay, we bombed the shit out of Syria. We can do great things on Iran. We can do that on Iran. I do understand what you're doing in Greenland. Let us try to do great things. So basically, I think this resumes very well. We destroyed Syria together. We bomb Iran. We can bomb Iran together. And please don't take Greenland. We are friends. Don't do that. So, and now Macron is saying, well, I was trying to push back a little bit, but I think the worst position is Keir Starmer. I think we should watch this video. Keir Starmer is offering the Cyprus basis. We've seen Declassified UK doing incredible reports on how intelligence was being gathered through several planes in Cyprus bases. So the Cyprus basis now is going to be a armed link arm
the initial strikes
to Iran. Look at this
US and Israel.
This idiot. Look what he's saying. He's actually an open declaring war against Iran, and not a support, but direct involvement of Britain.
The long-standing British position is that the best way forward for the regime and the world is a negotiated settlement with Iran where they give up their nuclear ambitions. Now, that's why I took the decision that the UK would not join the initial strikes on Iran by the US and Israel. Now, that decision was deliberate. It was in the national interest, and I stand by it. But when Iran started attacking countries around the Gulf and the wider region, the situation changed. Iran has now fired drones and missiles at 10 countries that did not attack them. These are allies of the UK, where we have hundreds of thousands of British people, as well as British military personnel. Our number one priority is protecting our people. The long-standing...
So the very important part he leaves out is that the US has launched an illegal war with no Congress, and it's unconstitutional, by the way, illegal under international terms, immoral, and also unconstitutional because There was no congressional approval for that. And he's launched this illegal, unconstitutional war, no congressional authorization, no imminent threat, no plan, no end game, no strategy, just destruction. Just for the sake of destruction, a perversion, which we know so well from the Epstein axis and the Epstein Zionist regime. Iran responded. And now Britain is using this response to say, we are going to go to war with Iran because it's our national interest to bomb Iran, to bomb the shit out of Iran. And I mean, Ileana, you British, what is this way of talking? He looks like he has something in his ass, stuck in his ass. What an idiot.
I mean, he's a puppet, so he probably has the US's hand in his ass.
He's a Zionist puppet. That's what he is, the maniac. He's a puppet of maniacs.
Yeah. Can I comment on that?
Please comment on that.
I mean, I'm not surprised by... Huh?
It's infuriating. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by, Europe's position now on Iran. I think it has to do with a few points. One of them is, a real subordination, with this transatlantic alliance. I think Europe has a rhetoric of its strategic autonomy, but in the end of the day, they remain as junior partners to the US-led security architecture, right? And even, after Trump threatened to take over Greenland, if Washington signals confrontation, and, hardly ever in the past century, European capitals were in dissent, right? As Trump put it well himself, they destroyed Libya, right? I think there's also energy and economic interests of Europeans and those three countries, especially in the Middle East, and favoring, always their relations with the Gulf monarchies, I think they're, to a lesser extent, maybe the nuclear deal from back in the days, but there's certainly, as you put well, a domestic political pressure and Zionist lobbying, I think.
And they're part of the empire. I mean, I know I keep repeating this over and over again, but this is the U.S. imperialist system. And my watch will be on U.S. imperialism.
Oh, no, before you have your watch, I want to show the American response now that Iran.
Yes, and please also continue with your watch. Yes.
No, I just want to show the response. You have it with you because I think I got the wrong one here. But the U.S. response is the most interesting response of all after it was bombed. The Tel Aviv is bombed into shambles. This is amazing. I love the U.S. response. Look at those maniacs. Look at those neo-Pentecostal maniacs.
Oh, praying with Trump.
The arms of our president. We pray for your continued blessing and favor to rest upon him. We pray for wisdom from heaven.
That's orange makeup
his
on, isn't it?
His mind, and Lord, you will guide him in these challenging times that we're facing today. I pray for your grace and your protection over him. I pray for your grace and protection over our troops and all of our men and women serving in our armed forces. And Father, we just pray you continue to give our president the strength that he needs to lead our great nation as we come back to one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We pray your heavenly blessing upon him.
Okay, I think we get the point here. It is a ridiculous farce. I mean, why are they doing that around him? Is he some sort of...
But as churches say, if you're going through hell, keep going.
Yeah. It's funny, we had a very similar scene in Brazil with Bolsonaro. It's almost like it's a plan. I think Steve Bannon writes the script and he distributes it to all these leaders worldwide. I was like, now is the time to use one. I mean, it's the exact same scene, it's Bolsonaro and everybody praying around him during a hard moment. It's insane.
I think what's kind of interesting here, though, is that, and Sara, can you continue with your watch? Because I think Turkey's response surprised me.
You go ahead. You go ahead. You can add to my watch. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, no, I want you to sort of explain Turkey's. I will pull it up, but can you explain Turkey's response?
So Turkey's response, well, according to Reuters, who quoted Erdogan, I never know how to pronounce that. I'm really sorry, Turkish friends. He was calling the US-Israeli attacks as a clear violation of international law, expressing solidarity with Iranian suffering and warning of destabilization. Make no mistake, Ileana, as you say, for the US, it's great to stamp this as a sole Israel attack. They can hide behind themselves. But Trump is not doing this time around. It's very explicit who's pulling the strings here. It's interesting because Turkey has a very ambivalent policy internationally, isn't it? But I'm looking forward to hear João's and your thoughts on Turkey.
So my thoughts on, I don't really have a lot of thoughts on Turkey. I think that, and I'll see what João has to say about this. I think it is a matter of maybe it's because they're very close to the region and they understand it's going to expand.
Yeah, and I think Israel should be very scared about this because Turkey has the military power to wipe Israel if they want to. So this is a very precious ally to them. It's very interesting. I think we should keep an eye on Turkey, how this is going to pan out, because Turkey is a very, very important piece on this chess play. And if we have all the Gulf countries changing their understanding that US no longer protects them the way they think, where the Iran bombing, Turkey must be also a bit afraid of Iran at this point. João?
Well, I mean, I think there's a few things to be brought up as far as Turkey is concerned. I mean, for one thing, Turkey remains a NATO member, right? So they're officially part of this alliance. So that's a fact, And I think under President Erdogan, Turkey has embraced this strategic autonomy, maintaining, Western security ties while deepening their economic and diplomatic engagements with the East, with Russia, with China, with Iran, and with the global South in general. So I think this reflects a kind of a global South trend, of rejecting this binary Cold War style alignment in favor of like a more nation-wise, interest partnership that serve their national development priorities. I think there's certainly a geographic issue. Turkey is right there. And I think everybody is somewhat cautious now of, what the U.S. might do. I mean, we're in beginning of March, and we had, Maduro taken away in Venezuela and Khamenei killed by the U.S. in 2 months. The year barely started. In Brazil, we're still celebrating Carnival, and the whole world, it's like I'm here trying to save the world, separating my plastic cups,
Right.
So it's,
I think that is also what my watch is going to be about. I've tentatively titled it, Why Aren't the Rats Jumping from the US Imperialist Titanic? And it's not a simple task to jump from the Titanic that is sinking, but certainly you have a point there. There's a regional proximity there. The fact that they're part of NATO means that they are complicit and expected active participants if it comes to that, if this war continues to escalate. So there's a lot of reasons why Turkey, but having also said that, we have to put it into context. So Turkey does have a history of trying to play off the global South and the global North. They've done this almost for the last, ever since Erdogan, probably, maybe before Erdogan. So that is definitely what they tend to do, which means that they're an unreliable ally for both parts, really. But yeah, it's still good to hear someone talk about, right? To still talk about the US and Israeli attacks as a clear violation of international law. That's important too.
Ileana, what is in your watch? I'm curious to hear about your watch. Me and João, we want to hear about you.
Are you curious about my watch? I'm nervous about it.
Curious about what watch?
All right, let's see how it goes. My watch is an attempt to answer my question that I've been pondering for a while, which is, why aren't the rats jumping from the US imperialist Titanic? Okay, I'm just going to change that. So why aren't the rats jumping from the US imperialist Titanic? The US-Israeli war in Iran begs the question further, while also clarifying our current imperialist world order, because this is just the latest example of the overt imperialist agenda that we see the US waging across the world. Of course, we've seen this, we've covered it, Venezuela, Cuba, Brazil, even everywhere. The US is everywhere. And as we covered with Marcos Rubio, the Davos speech, his colonial nostalgia speech, it is very much at the forefront of this Trump administration. But it's important for us to understand what imperialism is. I'm going to quote from Gabriel Rockhill because I am terrible at explaining imperialism, I think. But Gabriel is the author. I'm going to mute you for a little bit. Gabriel is the author of the recent book, Who Paid the Pipers of Western Imperialism? And he asserts that imperialism needs to be seen as a systemic organization of global capitalist social relations, that's a mouthful, that extracts value from the overwhelming majority of planet Earth and drives it towards the financial ruling class in the imperial core. So this is an extremely unnatural state. If you think about it, that's the global majority. That's all of us basically getting our being exploited, extracted, destroyed, really, all to move that money, the transfer of wealth, to the elite ruling class in the imperial core. And I always think about, like, what is the imperial core? It's not just the US, although the US is by far the most destructive country that we have, the biggest human rights violator in the world, the biggest transgressor of international law. Its unilateral sanctions causes upwards of 600,000 deaths a year. The US is absolutely the pinnacle of this US imperialist system. But the imperialist system includes so many other countries. Israel is a very prominent aspect of that country, and as rapacious. I just really want to make absolutely clear that I am not saying by any means that Israel is less rapacious, less destructive, less of anything. It is as morally depraved as the US. It just currently does not have as much power as the US. It cannot exist without the US backing. So in this context of this absolute belligerent, destructive, devastating, genocidal rampage that we are seeing, everything sort of trying to move towards that goal of maintaining the US in this pinnacle position, in this unipolar world, which is really no longer. It's not able to maintain a unipolar world. And this is because we are in the stage of capitalism, of monopoly and financialization. And this is where imperialism is absolutely imperative to continue this system of capitalism. Essentially, we are in the cannibalization stage of capitalism. Capitalism, it's any sort of productive capacity of capitalism has been exhausted. We are just now cannibalizing ourselves. We're like a zombie that's eating ourselves and eating the entire world. And China, is such a threat to this model because it is, first of all, very openly identifying it as itself as a socialist state. It says that unabashedly. And this means that it won its people's revolution. It's very proud of that fact. It's very proud that it's socialist. It is in the process of socialism, which is a revolutionary state. It's a state that has to keep working on these things. It's not at all static. It's very difficult to maintain. But of course, this is absolutely terrifying to the West because they have proven they have tangible results in this alternative system. So when I say that US imperialism Titanic is the Titanic, and it has already hit the iceberg, but China is not the iceberg. Its actual nature of capitalism is the iceberg. It's capitalism, its imperialism is its own enemy, own worst enemy. And that is what we're seeing. So back to my question, why aren't the rats jumping from the US imperialist Titanic? Why did Mark Carney in his Davos speech actually say this bargain no longer works? You cannot lie within the lie of mutual benefit through integration. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination. He said that in Davos, and then last week he goes back to unabashedly backing US imperialism in West Asia. And the reason he did this is because Mark Carney's a capitalist through and through. He studied economics. He worked in the finance and banking sector. He worked for Goldman Sachs for 13 years before going into politics. He is an imperialist. And he was only approaching China for a trade reset for capitalistic reasons. He understood the reason why we need to approach China. It is only for his, the own profit economic driver for Canada. That's the only reason. So his Davos speech was not an anti-imperialist speech. It was about wanting the middle powers. And he, claims Canada as a middle power. I'm assuming he would claim many other countries that are actually in the imperial system, but not the US, as the middle power. He wanted them to have a better seat at the table. So not only is he willingly complicit in the imperialist system, he wants more power within it. So he's just another imperialist. And we have to now take names. It is at this point that the rapacious nature of imperialism, we need moral clarity in this moment. You are either on the side of humanity or you're on the side of imperialism. And the lines are being drawn here again, once again. Palestine was one moment where people could wake up and see where the line was drawn. But here's another chance, because the Iran war will not stop with Iran. This week, for example, Israel launched a massive military campaign across Lebanon, shattering the supposed November 2024 ceasefire, which, by the way, Israel has violated hundreds, if not thousands of times since then. And they have used the Hezbollah firing rockets towards northern Israel on March 2 in retaliation for the killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. They've used that as pretext to carry out hundreds of airstrikes across Beirut's southern suburbs. Sorry. It's just very emotional when I have to talk about things like this. And I know it's really ridiculous here in London in my cozy flat, but they have issued urgent evacuation orders for over 80 villages in southern Lebanon and neighborhoods in and they are triggering mass displacement of hundreds of thousands fleeing their homes. So we're looking at, a modest estimate of nearly 60 people newly displaced. And this is in Lebanon. And the reason why I'm highlighting that Lebanon is because we're all focused right now on Iran, which is obviously, we're rightly focused on Iran, but we also have to be focused on Lebanon because it's all connected to this rampaging imperialist project. Now, the US allies of the US are also going to be affected by this. And I want to sort of bring this up before opening this up for discussion, because obviously you've talked about this already, Sara, that they will be, that Iran has hit 14 US military bases in 9 countries, and we can include Cyprus in that, the British RAF base, because it's very much intertwined. And also, the other thing which Iran has done is that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has declared the Strait of Hormuz closed to the US, Israel, Europe, and their allies. That is significant because they are apparently allowing China through the Strait of Hormuz. This is obviously bad for India, because remember, Sara, and I have to bring this up because last week we did a report on Modi accepting what we called the genocide medal from Israel. It is the Medal of Knesset. It was a completely made up medal that was just designed to show India's close relations with Israel. And under that video, the commenters were absolutely, we've never had so many negative comments in the entire Empire Watch. We have never had so many, and so many of them told us to make beauty tutorials, Sarah. So I'm of course very flattered by that. But this week, India, as we know, India is going to be hit pretty badly by this Strait of Hormuz situation because it imports 90% of its crude oil requirements. 50% of those crude oil requirements pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And Russia made up a huge percentage of that. But of course, with pressure from the US, that also has to greatly diminish. So what is India going to do if it decides to be a rat in the Titanic? It is just going to sink with the Titanic. But some good news. Well, we will see if it's good news. We're sort of seeing these contradictions in the imperialist system starting to crack, with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez doubling down on his criticism of the US strikes against Iran. Similarly, perhaps to Turkey, where it's like Sanchez, although he is labeled socialist, he's a European democratic socialist, which is not the same as an anti-imperialist socialist. He's pro-EU, for example. They are in NATO, I believe. And part of the reason why Trump wants to cut off all trade with Spain is because they're refusing to raise their military budget to 5% from 2%. So the consequences of this, because right now, Spain PM Sanchez is brushing off Trump's threat. So this will be a test of whether or not US has the ability to maintain power over the imperial structure. Let's see. Obviously, it's not so simple because Spain, as part of the EU, means that 27 EU nations negotiate trade agreements. So we'll see what happens with that. But in conclusion, to my question, why haven't the rats jumped from the US imperialist Titanic? And we have to look at China again, because it is a really long and arduous task here. I had an interview with KJ No on Global Majority for Peace. It is our latest interview, so please check that out, guys. It's really worth a listen to. But he talks about what China is doing to be independent from the imperialist structure, and he calls it the four sovereignties. It's linked to what we've been talking about already. The first one is the digital sovereignty. The second one is financial sovereignty. Then we have energy sovereignty. And of course, the fourth one being political and governance sovereignty. So you need those four sovereignties before you can even think of becoming a real, genuine sovereign country. Without those four sovereignties, you're really at the mercy of the US and the US imperialist system. And of course, this is incredibly, incredibly arduous. It's difficult. It's not simple, but the process has already begun. There are multiple initiatives, global development initiatives, global security initiatives. You also have things like BRICS, BRI, SCO, Shanghai Cooperative, BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, etc. There are so many initiatives already happening. So I think it is, in my watch, which I think went way over time, but I think appropriate that we start Global South Rising with this, the four sovereignties. So what do you guys think? Any arguments here?
I'd like to add like a fifth sovereignty that was recently announced by China, which is stimulating the domestic market. Right, because as of now, China depends a lot on exports, and there's a new strategy being developed that actually was announced now in the last meeting of the Communist Party, was to develop the local markets enough so there's less dependency towards the world markets as they fluctuate with, the wars that are raging the world. So I think that's something that, not only the domestic environment, but I think we need to build a sovereignty that is not dependent on the American, the United Statesian, and the empire's economy. And I think BRICS is structural there, right? And as you said, there's other initiatives like this Silken Belt initiative. But it's you know, and I think there's a lot of things that you touched upon that are very interesting, but also very dramatic. You know, it's like, why did the U.S. choose to bomb Iran now, and what are the implications of that to the rest of the world, and to even what we should be concerned about right now? So it's interesting, as you know, everybody was talking about the Epstein files. You know, we were getting closer and closer to very large scandals. Not that we don't know that Trump is a pedophile, but you know, things are getting, you know, worse and worse. The ties of Epstein to the Mossad were being reviewed, and then we have this attack, right? So now nobody talks about that anymore. Who's talking about the Epstein files? You know, it's like we're at the verge of Third World War. You know, I
think everyone is talking about the Epstein files, because what I hear over and over again is people saying the Epstein class or the Epstein, you know, even talking about this, they're talking about the Epstein elites that are pushing this war. And on this show, we talk a lot about the files, but we talk about it in the context of the imperialist system. It makes sense that these depravities that have been exposed by the Epstein files happen in an imperialist system, because it is about greed and capital and the accumulation, you know, bar nothing. There's no human cost that would be, you know, considered within that paradigm. And how do you control people? You know, how do you coerce people? It's like, this is the way you do it, you know, via things like the Epstein files. They're also calling to their most base nature, their most depraved nature, at the same time as using them for a specific purpose. So it really does make sense that imperialists would have something like Epstein as part of their arsenal to control the world, you know, because it's not a natural state, precisely. So.
Yeah, I guess my point is that, you know, I think the U.S. uses wars. Every time there's a crisis in capitalism, the U.S. engages in a war to kind of leverage the economy. And I think that, you know, more than ever, there is a lot of resentment against internal resentment against the U.S. foreign policies. You know, I think the last time there was so much criticism was maybe during the Vietnam War. You know, after that, you know, you lived in the States, I lived as well, you know, during Iraq War and, you know, Afghanistan. And it's just like, oh, this war is happening over there, right? And Americans weren't so, you know, concerned about it. It just seemed like something is happening very far away. And now I think there's a different issue. I saw like Tucker Carlson speak, you know, he's a spokesman of the right, criticizing the war from the point of view of evangelical Christians. So I think, and the reason I'm bringing this up is like, what can stop the Zionist, who will stop the Zionist craziness, you know, because I don't think Russia or China are willing to engage in war with the United States. And luckily they're not, because that would really mean maybe the end of the world. But on the other hand, who will stop, you know, bully Trump? You know, how far can he go? He's testing how far he can go. You know, he came to South America, took, you know, his barrels of oil, took Maduro out. Now, you know, endorsed the genocide in Palestine. Now is engaging in this war with Iran, endorsing all the evil doing of Netanyahu in the Middle East, as you well put. Who can possibly stop this? What can possibly stop this? Because I think this is an important question we ask, because I don't think it's a miracle, oh, the Chinese or the Russians. How can global
This
South...
is not, but I don't think this is about, so I think there are several things here. One, I do think we have to get away from the superhero paradigm, right? Like I think you're alluding to how we cannot expect this from Russia and China to save us all. That's not what you're saying at all. But I think also, you know, when we had Matthew Ho on last week, he talked about how this rapacious capitalist model that I'm talking about is also cannibalizing the military aspect of the US. So when we're saying that, you know, US's power, sort of historically, we're kind of looking at all these things, you know, it used to be they were the manufacturing powerhouse. They're no longer that anymore. They had a financial hold on the world with the world dollar. That is, you know, as we can see with BRICS and with different initiatives, there is an attempt to break through that. You know, things like the IMF or the banking system, etc. Like China has different models that are trying to come up with that. So almost on every single part of the US, we're looking at kind of like a diminishing of their power. The only place that they have been really investing has been the military. The military industrial complex is an extreme, you know, this is where they put, Trump is saying $1.5 trillion. But when we talked to Matthew Ho, he really pointed out that this capitalist system within this investment into the military is also cannibalizing it. So, for example, a huge percentage of the military budget just goes to paying the interest of the loan of past years. So, you know, and then the rest, a huge percentage goes to these manufacturing companies, Lockheed Martin. So in the end, the tangible assets that they have for the military is also diminishing. And you can see that even within their strategies right now, like with Venezuela, they did kidnap Maduro. It was a shock and awe tactic, but it wasn't troops on the ground. You know, I think we rightly mentioned the US hasn't really won a war, but what it's betting on is this idea, this propagandic idea of like, their supposed military invincibility. Israel also overstates its military invincibility. The US does that too. And there's a huge margin of it that is propagandic. So I think that's why we are in a pivotal moment, because Iran is not going to be so easy to subdue. They thought they could go in there, just kill Khamenei, and that's it. He stayed there because he's 86 and he decided to be martyred, you know, because he understood the task. It wasn't a matter so simple of like getting rid of him, let's install another, you know, regime and we're done. This war is going to be a huge cost to empire. So I think you're right in that what is going to stop them, it's not going to be necessarily an easy answer, of course, but they're already imploding from within. And then these external factors that are happening already. The cracks within the imperial structure, the global South rising, you know, like all these things that are sort of happening at once. And yes, hopefully the American people, the US public, if they could have this moral clarity of understanding that they are in fact the bad guys, if they could stop demonizing all these countries that are trying to be sovereign, and actually hold their people accountable, that would be a huge thing too.
Yeah, João, to your question, I think it's really a very important question. What is going to bring this to an end? Of course, I don't have the answers. Nobody does have the answers. History plays its course in such ways that nobody can really predict, and maybe that's the beauty of it as well, that we're going to be surprised by a lot of events. We're going to be surprised by the fierce resistance of the Palestinian people. We're going to be surprised by the fierce resistance of the Lebanese people, of the Houthis. We are going to be surprised by the bravery of Iranian people, and we already seen the signs of it. And as Ileana mentioned, there is an autophagic element that is intrinsic and is part of the very nature of exploitation, of human and nature exploitation. It will run its course. And I think in America, this shows also its moral autophagic elements when you have ice, when you have people in poverty, when you don't have a distribution, when you have the MAGA itself realizing that this farce of the national interest, because we already knew this was many farces of imperialism, but the farce of national interest, it was something that already captured American minds. It's in our national interest to go. It's our national interest. And I think if you looking into the members of parliament talking right now, they are repeatedly saying this is not in our national interest to genocide. It's not in our national interest to bomb Iran. You see people from the military being punished for saying it is, I can't see a national interest on that. So I think there's this element of doubting the national interest element. What is the national interest? Such an important question in the US. Is it Israel first? Is it America first? Is it the workers first? Is to bomb people? And I think this is a paradigm change within the US, which is a very important element.
Yeah.
And I think when you ask Ileana, why aren't they jumping, the rats aren't jumping the boats? Here I have to say there is a very psychological element that capitalism transforms our consciousness. When we are constantly in the environment of exploitation, competition, hatred, we become these people that are always anxious, always judging, always thinking that our existence in not harmonic with differences with other people. It's our self-interest first. So there's this huge element of the psychological element that capitalism produces in our consciousness. It's so difficult to break from it. And
also, like we were saying, you know, with Matthew, like people within the Pentagon don't even recognize that they're in an imperialist system. They will swear back and forth that they're not part of an empire. You know, like,
yeah, but I think there is a huge element that maintains all the rats in the sinking ship, and the ship will sink and they will not jump. It's called supremacy. It's called racism. Europe and America have the firm belief of superiority, no matter how far they cannot. And this is a very this is a subconscious element that empires.
No, but yeah, you cannot separate like the idea that you are righteous in genociding a people. You absolutely can't separate imperialism from supremacy. Like this sense that you have the right. Like, why does Marco Rubio think that the US has the right to be number one when they have done nothing for the world, really, except for try to destroy it? And they're not even showing metrics of number one in their own country. But
when I'm talking about the supremacy, I'm not talking only white people. I'm talking the internal colonizers.
I'm not talking about white people either, you know?
Yeah. No. I'm just clarifying my point. I'm not touching your point. When I say no, you have the assimilation of people who are there that has a huge level of
supremacy.
It's a cultural one, exactly. Like you have Priti Patel, who is the daughter of Indian migrants, oppressing people, sending people to a third country, migrants to a third country, and in the middle of the ocean, and spitting fire. You know, she's the white face of British. She's the Indian face of British white supremacy. So I'm talking about this cultural element, as John pointed out. So I'm done. Sort of.
It's like a moral superiority. They have a moral superiority, and as if they are innately superior. Like regardless of whatever other characteristics that don't back that up. Yeah, it is absolutely there. You're right. And that's horrible. But how do you feel about Global South rising now? We're kind of at a very low point, I believe.
No, I mean, look, I think I'm going to have to step out, but I just want to wrap up with you know, what I feel about Global South rising. I think, look, we're at, you know, it's at during moments of crisis that we can come up with, big changes, and I think we need to, I'm, always trying to be an optimist. I say that I'm a pessimist in short term, but an optimist in the long term. And, there's no point in questioning the system if we're not ready to make it oblivious, right? So, part of that has to do with understanding all the amazing work that has been done by China, and about all the work that is being developed by the BRICS and a multipolar world that at the same time that, as Ileana very well put, the US is an empire in decline. An empire in decline can do very desperate actions. It's like Nero, who set fire in Rome. That's the perfect comparison for Trump. To me, it seems like that's what he's doing. Everything he does makes China stronger. He repeatedly did all these actions that made China stronger. And I would not doubt that after this whole shabao in Iran, the biggest beneficiary of Iranian oil is China and Russia. I wouldn't be surprised, because that has happened, for instance, in Brazil with all the privatizations. So I think we need to look at, with very critical eyes, and very, it's very concerning, because when a country turns bellic like this and resorts to war, if you were emotional, and rightfully so, because it's terrible. 120 girls were killed in Iran, at a school. They were 7 to 12. What kind of barbarian pedophile, leads the world this way? So we need to be at the forefront of this criticism, but always looking towards ways to, help, to find ways for us to cooperate in the global South, to cooperate internationally, and even with Europe. Like you said, Spain jumped out of the boat. They jumped out of the boat, They jumped out. He was a rat that jumped out of the boat. The one rat jumped out of the boat, So some rats are jumping out of the boat, So let's throw rescue rafts at those rats that are jumping off the boat, and not just, oh, you were with them in the past, so I'm not going to, And I think even a lot of countries in the Middle East are going to start to, that were U.S. allies, are going to start looking at them differently, because they're suffering the impacts, So we need to be willing to embrace former U.S. allies. To gather us in the global South is going to be essential to topple this system, And I think we need to keep a positive outlook. And as much as, all the military action led by the U.S. and by, the Zionist state of Israel is horrible, it also shows how weak they are, actually, and shows, that they're trying, in the end of the game, as Ileana put it very well, they're trying to reach China. They're trying to reach China that, buys 25% of its oil out of that region, so it's very significant. That's what, that in the end of the game, that's who they're trying to reach. They're trying to reach the BRICS, and they're trying to reach China. So, I think our president here in Brazil needs to, not be gullible by, we're friends with Trump, and this type of discourse, which can be very misleading. And at the same time, it's very tricky. We don't want to be bombed, we don't want to have our president kidnapped. So having said that, it was a pleasure to do this first Global South Rising with you. Ladies, I hope I did okay. And
you did brilliantly. I think we can wrap up. It's a beautiful note to wrap up.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, and I hope all the audience, I hope the audience enjoyed our new format and our new show, and hope, sorry, not the best send off, but yeah, I hope that we will be able to cover actually more encouraging, optimistic news, as well as keeping the empire accountable, but more optimistic news in the future. So thank you everyone for watching, and thank you new co-hosts for being
Bye-bye.
part of it. Okay, bye everyone. See you next week.
Thank you.